Hi, I want to talk to you about the Ogham and much more and more broadly than just the Ogham. I'd like to talk to you a bit as the process of developing your relationship with trees as a part of the ovate process. Give you a little sense of why and what I'm hoping to do here. First of all, trees are important to Druids. I mean, they're a pretty crucial part of our sort of belief system and how we would tend to work in the world. Um, but there's a lot of different kinds of trees, and there are, I mean, talking about trees is like this big thing. And it's like, I'd like to sort of narrow that down a little bit about what we're talking about in the process. This is kind of how, at least the Green Mountain Druid Order, how we prioritize the trees we're focusing on, and a little bit how we think about them. I don't know what kind of relationship you have with trees, nor do I know what kind of relationship you should have with trees. That's something you have to decide and you have to develop for yourself. But I want to try and provide some context for thinking about that and how to start your relationship and how to start the development process of it. This has changed within the Green Mountain Druid Order since I've been a part of it. What I'm talking about now is a lot more detailed and depth than what I experienced as an ovate when I first came into the process. But I think I can give you some sense of place to start and how to do some things here. Specifically, I want to talk about the Ogham and what the nature of the Ogham is. And let me see if I can share some things on my screen here. These symbols here, these trees, are part of what's known as the traditional Ogham. There are 20 of them, starting with birch, rowan, or mountain ash, alder, willow, ash, and they have these symbols associated with them. And then over here, I've got some sense of some of the symbolism associated with this. You will have this as a handout from me, by the way, so you don't need to get it from here. What's notable about these trees, number of things, is you look at the symbols for the first 4 groups of them. This group, fir through yew, and vine through elder. And they're of one type of symbol. I mean, they're lined with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cross pieces in it, either straight or an angle or one side or the other, those sorts of things. And then you have another set of symbols down here for grove and spindle and honeysuckle and beech and sea. Those symbols are different than the other ones. They're fairly clearly different kinds of symbols than the earlier ones are. They're more, generally, aside from the grove one, they're much more sophisticated symbols. One of the things I discovered as I was started really exploring the Ogham, was sort of realize I thought there was a traditional Ogham, I could just learn it and go to the source. Well, as it turns out, not so true. Let me show you another piece here that I think is worth looking at. I went through and read several different books on the Ogham. And one of the things I found generally was, what I discovered to my astounded, just being astounded at this, is they didn't all say the same things. They didn't even include the same trees. Birch was always the first one. It's always got the same symbol here. Rowan or mountain ash has always got the same symbol. It's number 2. But some people have alder next, and some people have ash next, and some people have willow, and it's like I went, well, wait a minute, that's not right. Down here, some people have one person had pine for the first one of this group. One had fir, another had elm for it. Another going, huh? So what I discovered was there is no generally accepted one way of having the traditional Ogham. What I discovered was there is not a traditional Ogham. There are several Oghams that are different from different authors. And that was a real shock to me, quite frankly. I didn't expect that. I kind of went, huh, that isn't the way it's supposed to be. So this is not too surprising, actually, when you think about it. The Ogham was developed a couple of millennia ago at a time when there was not written language. So what we know of it is what has come down through legend and other places. We know birch is always the one symbol. I mean, that's fairly common, but the other ones have changed over time. And if you go back to, where to go? This one. This has, there's one set of symbols here. I basically picked one to work with in it. But you start to look at these things also, the other thing you will notice about this thing as you work through it is saying, you know, unless you've been to England or you've been on the continent, you probably haven't seen much gorse in your life. And I look at things like heather and kind of going, heather isn't really a tree. Heather's closer to what I think of as a bush than a tree. And going, okay, but and I mean, it's like we were, if you went, if you remember recently the trip to the Ove Grove, Vern talked about having within that having a pair of yew as the entranceway to it. But I'll bet you haven't seen many yew in the United States because it's not native to this ground. Vine. What does vine mean? Well, I think it means grape, but it's not clear to me. And ivy. Again, I don't tend to think of ivy as a tree. Reed is a tree, or no, reed's blackthorn. Well, most of you, if you're like me, have never seen blackthorn. um, spindle. I thought spindle was something you twisted, or circled around. It's like these are actually trees that then was not here, which is on some is broom is a tree that shows up in this group also. So there are lots of trees here that we don't have. Right here, I have a piece of, when I went to England, I actually cut myself a piece of blackthorn because it's hard to tell. I've carved on it, I've done a lot of things where blackthorn's a fairly heavy, solid wood, but we don't have blackthorn in the United States. It's not here anyplace. And if I go back to this group of trees, there are a number of them on here that we don't have locally. And while yew and fir are both conifers, again, there's a conifer there that we don't have around here. There's no original. One of the problems with the original Ogham set is that we don't have many of those trees around here. So it's something that it's not quite sure how we work with them. Well, let me tell you about the Vermont Ogham, because the Vermont Ogham was not in place when I started. When I started this process working with it, it didn't exist. And there is a set of trees that are in the Vermont Ogham, and this is the set of trees, and you'll get a copy of this also. All of these trees are native to Vermont, or native to the Northeast at very least for us. They are all trees that you will find around here. One of the things that happened was when Ivan came to this country and he met Fern and decided that there's a couple good reasons to stay in this area of the world. He wanted to work with trees, and he wanted to teach us to work with trees. And one of the things he said is, if you're going to work with trees, you got to be trees of your environment. So Ivan, and I think it was the original clan, I think it was the Elder clan, started picking out 25 trees that were the Vermont Ogham set. And these are the 25 trees that are part of that set. One of the things about this set of trees is that it's different in a lot of ways. I mean, among other things, it's like We have in this, we have a fir, we have a cedar, we have a spruce, we have a pine, we have hemlock, and we have tamarack. Those are, it's like, so, well, the traditional Ogham has 2 conifers to it. The Vermont Ogham has 6 conifers in it, because in this area of the country, we know conifers. We do a lot of conifer work. And the Vermont Ogham is intended to be a set of trees that we see as the primary trees we work with. That doesn't mean you can't work with more trees than this or other ones. I personally have a lot of affinity with chestnut, even though there's no chestnut around. There are very few chestnut. You can find chestnuts around here, but it's not easy, and not big ones at this point. There are a lot of trees that interest us that we can work with around here. And when I say work with, I mean, it's like you can lay hands on them. You can touch them. You can see them during the different seasons and how they go differently from winter to spring to summer to fall. I mean, you get a sense of how they grow and change. And if you're going to have a relationship with a tree, it's got to be a relationship over time. You got to get some type of time to get to know the tree and get to know more about the tree. I would just go back to one more thing I want to say about the Vermont Ogham. As you may notice with this, because there's some consistency with symbols here. This group of 5 is very much the same as the original, the traditional Ogham set. These are the same 5 trees in the traditional Ogham set, at least many of them, and they're the same symbols. Here, when you start with lilac in the second group of 5, the symbols change from what they were in the original set. Yet the set of symbols have a consistency to them. That came primarily through Ivan. I was working with him at the time about these trees, and I was really wanting to develop an Ogham set using the Vermont trees, but we didn't have a consistent set of symbols. And truthfully, Ivan developed this. Now, he had input from Fern and I in it, but I could say, I think Ivan made most of the decision about this. And at first I kind of went, oh, and then the more I look at it, I go, no, it really do make sense, and I like it. And I've gotten to work with it much more. If you look at that set, well, go back, I just took it down here. There, and the Vermont Ogham has 25 symbols in it, and it also then has 2 other pieces to it typically. One of them is the X for grove, which is considered all the trees, and there's typically another one which is a blank one, which if you do it an Ogham set, it often will contain a blank one. So there are 27 pieces to a Vermont Ogham set, because what it's doing is trying to look at all 25 of those trees, plus the possibility of all trees, and plus the possibility of saying, maybe none of these trees, and maybe it's a different tree, and there's other possibilities for it. And I'll say more about that use of that in the process. The question that comes up is, so how do you use it? Why do we do it? Well, I would tell you, when I first started working with this thing, one of the things I kept going is, somehow I'm supposed to be developing a relationship. What does that mean, having a relationship with trees? Now, there's a funny part of it. At one point, my grandson came to me, and at the time he was about 8, and he goes, "Is it true that you talk to trees?" I went, "Yeah, it is. Yeah, I do talk to trees. But I got to tell you, it's not a big deal, really. Any idiot can talk to a tree. It doesn't take a whole lot of sophistication to talk to a tree. The question is, can you hear what the tree has to say to you? That's the difference. And that's what Druids tend to work towards, is learning to hear what the trees have to say to us. That takes some work. It's not an obvious thing. And there's a couple things, reason about it. One is trees operate on different time frames than we do. It's not unusual for a tree to be 150 years old. That's just not uncommon at all. They don't move around a lot. You know, they don't move from place to place very much. They tend to stay in one place and work in a single environment their entire life. If I want to communicate with a tree, part of what I need to do is I need to sort of slow myself down to work with a tree. Now, there's some ways of working the tree. A framework I've worked with over some time is a fairly simple thing: head, heart, hand. Head. I think it's important to learn about trees, to learn how to identify them, for instance. I would challenge you as one of the things that you should do is get yourself a good tree identification book and learn to identify all 25 trees in the Vermont Ogham. Guess so you can see a tree and going, oh, that's a fir. Oh, that's a tamarack. Oh, that's an elm. You know, it's like being able to see a tree and recognize it. And there are tree books out there that have how to identify trees in winter, how to identify in the summer, what their fruit looks like, what their bark looks like, and all those sorts of pieces. So that you could learn to look at a tree and say, oh, I know what kind of tree that is. Now, I suspect there's some that you already do know. I don't know how many of the 25 you know, but it's something I think is worthwhile getting. The other thing is to learn some things about how they grow, what their cycles are, um, get to know the physiology of trees. I mean, one of the things I find just absolutely fascinating is when you damage a tree, you take an ash tree, for instance, and you run a car into it, and it knocks some stuff off and breaks open the bark, and you get down to that, so you can actually see the wood in the tree inside the bark. Assume you don't kill the tree by doing that. What happens over time with the tree is over time the bark starts slowly moving in and closing in more and more until it covers that wound, and then it grows over the wound. So over time, you may not be able to see the damage done to that tree. On the outside, it looks a little strange perhaps in the bark, but you don't next it may not look like damage. However, if at some point you cut down the tree and get inside of it, what you discover is the damage shows, the mark of that damage shows in the heartwood of the tree. It's there underneath it, even though on the outside there doesn't appear to be any damage to it at all. I think that's just fascinating. How does nutrients, how stuff work with trees? That's important to know. I would tell you, for me, part of what what I did, because I had the opportunity to, I realized I've never had any formal training about trees, and I discovered that the Extension Service, through the Department of Forest and Parks and Forests, Forests and Parks, they used to have a program called Steward of the Urban Landscape. And it was all about trees. And it was like a 30-hour course done on public television through interactive television all over the state. And I really loved it, because it was like they taught me a whole bunch about physiology and forest management and a variety of things like that. They also did things like I had to go in and learn how to prune a tree. I had to go in and learn how to plant a tree. I planted some trees in my life, but I didn't know what I was doing with it. And as I learned, it's like, well, there's better ways to planting trees than others. There's things I had a number of misconceptions, but a part of developing a relationship to me is you learn to use your head about it. You learn to think about it. You learn some information about it. You learn how the trees, what they look like and how they work. And they work differently among the 25 trees. There are patterns among the trees. One of the trees, for instance, that is in the Vermont Ogham is the sumac. Well, many of us tend to think of a sumac as it's a weed tree. It grows everywhere. The answer is it doesn't grow anywhere. It grows really well in difficult soils, is one thing about it. The other thing about sumac, for me, thinking about the pattern of sumac, is I think of sumac as it's a very social tree. You almost never see a single sumac tree. When you see sumac, it's almost always in a group. Now that's different than like an oak. You will see oak out in the middle of a field all by itself, or a maple. You might see it all, but you'll have groves of different kinds of things. But you also see many different kinds of individual trees, but not sumac. Sumac is one that it's a very social tree. And it's like that's a pattern, part of the pattern of it. You look at tamarack. Tamarac's a funny tree. Tamarac's a conifer that drops its needles every year. It's interesting. It's like, if that's not the way conifers are supposed to act. Not only that, conifers tend to grow in swampy soil as it's transforming from bog to meadow. And it's a tree that grows in those sorts of settings more than others. That's a piece just of the information about trees. That's part of the head. The heart. I think a part of heart for me is learning to listen to a tree. Being able to take the time to sit back and look at the tree in its environment, where it is, how it moves when the wind comes through or doesn't move. All the pieces of its environment sort of broken, the whole of it. I use the word broke. Those of you who may have read Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein, when it was new, it's an old science fiction story. Use the word groke, which means sort of appreciate the fullness of it, all of the aspects of it, and trying to really come to accept that thing. And then there's a part of being able to sit down and listen, to be able to open yourself up to feel what the tree has to say to you. One of the things I've done a fair amount of is divination with trees, because earlier on I showed you some stuff about there's some associations with different trees. And one of the things, as we get further on, I'll talk more about divination. Maybe not in this video, but I'll talk to you more about divination as we go through this stuff. So there's head, there's heart, and there's hands. For me, an important part of developing relationship with trees is to work with trees. That means things like planting and pruning and cutting and fertilizing and mulching and those sorts of things. Doing some tree shaping. I have a small cherry tree out here in my yard that I've been shaping, sort of bonsaiing for some time. See if I turn it around here. Over here in my office, this is one of our trees, and but over here that's a jade tree over in the window over there. I've had that jade tree for over 40 years, and I've been shaping and bonsaiing it for 40 years, working with that tree, sort of shaping its growth and trying to help it become something different and something more. One of the other things I've done from my relationship with trees is I became a first detector. I got trained in identifying the emerald ash borer, and have gone out to look for emerald ash borer and train people in looking for it and monitor traps for emerald ash borer and so forth, which is coming to destroy our ash trees. And it's going to, and it makes something that makes me very sad in my heart. But it's a way I work with trees also. I would just also note for you, the bigger part for me is part of my learning to work with trees was learning to work with the wood. I'm a wood turner. This is a birch goblet that I turned, which was one of my first turning pieces. I was like, oh, I really like that, a piece of it. But working with that versus here is a sumac, and I'm trying to get the light better here. I don't know if this will show up well. Sumac has just fascinating coloring to the wood. When you first cut a sumac, one of the things you discover with it is there's greens that go in the wood here, inside the wood. And that's just a really fascinating piece. It's not a very strong wood, which is part of why this thing is so much thicker than this thing is on the inside, because this wood's not very strong. My favorite wood to work with right now is apple. This is a bowl that I turned more recently. What's called a live edge bowl. It's got this side of it's actually this is actually this bowl was part of this is turn it this way for you. This was a crotch right in here of the tree, and it had one branch going up this way and one branch going up this way. And I cut that piece of wood and then turned that piece of wood. And the coloring in it is like it's sort of an infection that goes on in the wood. It's part of what I talk about, just shaping the wood. And I love apple. I love working with apple. It's a lot of fun. But I do it because it helps me get the feel of the wood. And that tells me more about the trees. It's sort of my handiwork with it. And then I started developing Oghams. And one of the things your challenge this year is to make your own Ogham set. I will show you some things of mine here, some different types of Oghams. These are pieces of my Ogham set. There's one, and here's one, and here's one. You'll notice these are different shapes to these things because each piece is that's the wood kind of wood it is. When I have a pine, the wood is pine. That's fir. Wherever I pick up, what's this? The numbers off, those kind offhand. But I've picked up. I went out and found each of the 25 trees, and then I sat down and meditated with the tree and asked the tree for permission to cut a piece about that size off the tree, which I brought back and then cut up into some things that are about that thick. I sanded the things down. These are really smooth, and I'll bring them in next so you can see them and actually touch them. I love the feel of them. And then I wood burnt the symbols on this on one side, and on the opposite side, what I did is I did the Ogham symbol with a set of hills underneath it. And I did a similar one on each one of them. On one side, that's the one side of it, and then the other side is a symbol for it. And I put this thing across the bottom, which indicate the bottom of this thing, which way was up on this thing. Because without that, is it this or is it this? And those are different symbols. So I had to do something to make as a way of getting at that stuff. This took me some time. It took me, I think, 2 years to find all the trees, to get all the pieces, to do all that woodwork. So it took me some time to do it. You can do it much simpler than that. This is a symbol. There's another one. Here what I did, instead of drawing the circle at the bottom to show the bottom, is I added feet at the bottom on it. Again, there's feet on the bottom of each of the symbols here as a way of showing which way is down. And then on the flip side, I have this. Now this wood, I went and bought a dowel used like for curtain rods, for rods, closet rods, and I just cut them in pieces this long, sanded it, and did sanded down, wood burned it again. Then I put some oil on it to make sure it won't burn out. So it's like, that's another way of doing it. The way I've done it here is not the right way. It's the way I did this one because I really wanted to spend the time learning to use it. I'd show you this thing here also as an alternative to this. I bought this when we were in England. Oops. This way. And this way. These are, again, each one of these are the wood itself from the individual tree. That's a twig from it that somebody had skimmed off, somewhat flattened a bit, and then burnt the symbols into it with a direction on it. Different way of doing it, completely legitimate. There's not a right way for doing this, and there's different ways for it. And finally, I'd say the last year's, the third year students right now, what some of them did, I want to say it, I haven't got to be able to get it yet. is they used acorns and they carved the symbols into acorns, which I thought, well, that's a really cool one. I have folks who have taken these things here and just taken a single tree and done it all from the same tree. I gave my friend Sally Crow a set that was done out from hawthorn, because Sally's tree is hawthorn, which she really is deeply invested in. So I made a set out of hawthorn. I gave it to her as a gift at one point. If you have a tree that you really like and want to work with, it's perfectly legitimate to just find a branch, cut it up, and do that stuff with it. We ask you to do as a way to work with the wood and to get your hands on it, because part of me, there's thing we're talking about here is your relationship, what you know about them, how you feel and interact with them, and how you work with them with your hands. How that will evolve. I mean, I'm not expecting you to turn into a wood turner. This is an interesting thing, but wood turning takes some investment of equipment to do it. And it may not suit you at all. That may not be the stuff you want to be doing. I thought the folks using acorns and working with that was a really interesting thing, because these are folks who may not want to work with power tools, and they found it much simpler to do it that way. You have to work that out for yourself. What I'm going to ask you to do is to think about the trees that you're working with. I'm going to stop right here for a second and pick up something. One of the things I've included for your handout is, where's it at? Here it is. The form looks like this. It's got the 25 trees on it that you need for the Vermont Ogham. I encourage you to take this thing and do a little self-assessment with it. How much do you think you know about each of these trees? How would you rate your connection with this tree? And that's, again, much more heart than knowledge is head, connection's heart. Recognition, that's a biggie for you. It's like, for me, it's like, this is one of the important things, is you see that, can you recognize a tree? Now, some of them are kind of slap you in the face. I suspect most of you can recognize a lilac, for instance. It's one of our trees here. I bet lilac is not terribly hard for you. Birch is not a hard one to. But just check out where can you recognize it, and see what you have on your own property, for instance, or right in the immediate vicinity of you. Pick out what you have here. And once you get yourself a good tree book, start taking your tree book along with you as you're going on walks. And, oh, look at that one. And then finally, the priorities. What's the priority for you to learn more about this tree? Because 25 trees takes a while. This is a big thing to do. And what's your priority for you in this thing? Because that's your decision. You got to make sense of this. I would tell you some stuff may come up for you. And I would share, for instance, it's like your relationship with individual trees will be different with each tree. True story here. When I first moved to Stowe, which is where I live, we lived in a house, and out behind the house there was a spring, which was the water source from the house. And every now and again, the spring would get blocked, and I'd have to go out and get this concrete lid off it, move to one side, and I'd hang over the side, clearing the thing out. It was a real pain, but I would do it. Well, we ran out of water one day, and I went, here it is again. So I went running out, and I stepped on a thorn. And I had on soft shoes, and this thorn stuck up through the bottom of the shoe, well into my foot. I spoke harshly about that. Nicest thing I can say. I pulled the thing out, and then I got ticked off. And I went and got a chainsaw, and I cut down the hawthorn tree that was there, saying, I am not going to step on that again. Well, that set off a time of some disaffiliation between hawthorn and I. When I started doing this process, I went through my 25 trees, and I was getting close to the end of it, and I hadn't found a hawthorn. I couldn't find a hawthorn. And I looked and I looked and looked and couldn't find a hawthorn. And I really spent some time really thinking about it and looking at pictures, and I couldn't find a hawthorn. And one day I was walking with my book with me along the rec path in Stowe. And I'm walking along and I kind of went, wait a minute, got out my book. I'm going through going, my God, it's a hawthorn. I found a hawthorn. So I sat down and spent probably 45 minutes with this hawthorn, just wandering around, sitting in different places, looking at it from different directions and touching it and picking some of the fruit off it, sort of taking the fruit apart and doing all that kind of stuff with it. I thought, okay, I've finally seen hawthorn. I turned around and started walking back to my car and walked maybe 5 paces and stopped and looked and went, oh, there's another hawthorn. And I walked a little and went, and there's another hawthorn. And there's another hawthorn. By the time I got back to my car, I had identified probably 7 more hawthorn, which I had walked past on the way up the rec path. I got home and I'm wandering around my yard and going, oh my God, there's a hawthorn over there in my yard. A more wooded area of my house. My sense of that is I did damage to a hawthorn, and hawthorn's going went, and it wouldn't let me see it for some time until I convinced hawthorn that I was sorry, that I was prepared to reapproach it. I think of, I think my relationship with hawthorn is if you've had a partner that you've cheated on, and your partner's taken you back but hasn't forgiven you, that's sort of me and hawthorn, that kind of relationship. It's a little troubled piece of relationship, and it's like we're working it out. I've actually planted another hawthorn in my yard, in addition to the one I've got, and I've done some pruning around the other hawthorn to give it a better place to live. And I'm trying to make up, but that's my relationship with hawthorn, and it's a troubled relationship, I would say. Not everybody has that. That's my relationship with hawthorn. There are other trees you'll find the same thing with. Some of them you align with easily, and some will be much more difficult. When I went looking for elder, it took me a while to find elder. And the first time I sat down with an elder bush, I kind of went, is it okay for me to cut a piece of you because I want to do this? And I got this, no! And I went, okay, let's not cut this bush. I mean, typically what my reaction is when I would ask if it was okay to cut it, I'd get this, okay, I can do that. But it's more like that kind of reaction for it. Not with elder. And you get to know elder, it's like elder holds grudges, is my sense, and needs to be treated carefully. And I've planted elder in my lawn yard also. I don't have a bad relationship with elder, but I'm just kind of going, elder's a little more prickly than some of the other trees around some of the stuff. So you got to be careful with elder. That's my relationship with elder. Yours may be, oh, elder and I get along great. It's like, but that's your relationship with that particular tree. And that's what we want you to develop as your relationship with a specific trees. I think that's all I want to say about the process right now. Part of what we're asking you to do this year is to develop your own Ogham set. And you have a number of choices about doing that. And I'd be happy when I'm around weekends to consult with you about the process and the mechanics of tools and those sorts of things, and sandpaper and wood burning versus drawing or painting, or there's a lot of choices about that stuff. We're also going to ask you to develop a wand. Get yourself a wand. I showed you the one I have, this piece of blackthorn, which is a powerful sort of wood. It's the one you're going to be kind of conscious of. I also had a friend who brought me back a piece of gorse from England, which I also just really, I'm not quite sure what I'll do with. For a while, I had a crystal stuck in the end here in this one, but it didn't stay in well, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that next. I have other sorts of woods that I use as wand, and in fact, what piece I have is I will bring some weekend for a ceremony a piece of a wand that Ivan made that I've done some work on to take further, which is a snake one. Um, it's pretty impressive. I will show that to you at some point. But you're going to need to be again pick the kind of wood that works for you, that feels like a good, where the wood feels good in your hand, and you feel connected to the wood. That's part of what we're going to be asking you in the wand, is developing your wand. So those are some of the tasks we're going to have for you. Some of the hand stuff. We're going to ask you to spend some time meditating, trying to connect with a tree, picking out one. And you're going to ask you to do some tree research along the way. And I think next week or the week after that, next session or the one after that, Fern will give you the tree research form. And there's some stuff we ask you to look at about trees to get to know a tree, a single one, in more depth. And what I will share with you at some point is I've developed a divination guide, because I've worked with all 25 trees and gotten to know them, and gotten some sense of the symbolism of the impact of those things. And it reflects my relationship with those 25 trees. It may not reflect yours, but so I can use the trees to do divination and ask, and I will talk more about the divination process as we go on also with you. But first, you got to start developing your relationship with trees, so you do that. And that's a piece for you to be thinking about. That, right, you can start right away with the form that I've included for you about the 25 trees, about what do you know about them, which ones, what level of familiarity you have, those sorts of things. Start looking at that and getting yourself a good tree guide, finding one that really works for you. Those are some concrete things you can start on soon. I think my response from there is Ogham.